is an hour for you to ask any questions that you might have around the whole area of recruitment and selection. So although I'm happy to go through this presentation, do put your hand up at any time. Bethan, you might have to stop me if I can't see some of the hands up if you have any questions. So I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. And I'm just taking you on a journey from the beginning of the recruitment sort of cycle all the way to the end in a sort of bit of a whirlwind tour of this. And what I hope to cover is a little bit of the principles around recruitment and selection, which is you need to have a full understanding and a really clear understanding about the job purpose and the requirements of the role. You need to think about how you're going to attract suitable applicants. And what's really important is you follow a fair and consistent approach in the way in which you recruit and select applicants. And that process needs to be objective and non-discriminatory. And I'll talk about that briefly as I go through the presentation. And you need to have some way or some methodology of being able to assess and select on the basis of the required knowledge, the skills, experience, the values that you want to see in that ideal employee in that role. And it's really important that you follow a lawful process, because there can be massive impact in this selection process if you get it wrong. And hopefully at the end, you'll get the right person for the job. So that's where you're heading for. And before I start, I just want to make sure that I focus on your needs. So if you want to unmute, or if you don't want to unmute, can you put in the chat what you're hoping to learn from this session, so I get a feel for what it is that you hope to understand or learn by the end of this hour. Who wants to kick off? Tracy?
I'm happy to start the ball rolling. Perhaps I should say I'm a trustee for Citizens Advice Central Dorset, and I'm People of the Chair of the People's Subcommittee. So obviously understanding more about approaching recruitment and selection from an equality point of view is very important. I've worked for Dorset Council prior to stopping work and taking up this trustee role. So I come with experience of recruitment and selection and fairly good understanding of the Equality Act, but it's also, I'm very aware that knowledge can go out of date. So this is about refreshing and keeping my knowledge up to date, and also working with other trustees that might not have that depth of experience, how I can synthesize it and share that knowledge with them, particularly when they come from different experience perspectives as well.
Okay, thank you.
Being able to convince them that this is the right way of doing it.
Yeah. Anyone else?
From Anne in the chat, says she wants to end up feeling confident that the charity is advertising in the right places, not accidentally excluding anyone in the way they're sharing job roles.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Sonia, I just wanted to have a brush up, really. It's been some years since I was a hiring manager, so I'm just going to listen generally. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so this, as I said, is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour. So if at any point you think, no, I need to understand a little bit more in depth about that, then just stop me and we can talk about that. So let's go. So let's start with the Equality Act, which Tracy already mentioned. And this act prohibits not only discrimination, but harassment and victimisation in relation to 9 protected characteristics. And does anyone want to shout out what they think these 9 protected characteristics are? Let's go for it. I'll note them.
Age.
Anyone else?
Disability.
Yeah.
Gender in the chat.
Yeah.
Sexuality.
Yeah. sexual orientation as it's termed in the Act.
Ooh, religion in the chat.
Religion and belief. So it's not just religion, it's belief as well.
We had race, yeah? Is that?
No, that's another one. 4, 5, 6. You've got 6. You've got 3 more to find. You've got age, disability, gender, sexual orientation, religion and belief, and race.
Your background? Possibly?
That would come under race.
You mean social mobility?
I was thinking more, yeah. Like
social class. Or
probably class is the better way of saying it.
No, it's not a protected characteristic. So it's not a protected characteristic. Let me show you what here we go. So the ones that you missed out with: gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, and pregnancy and maternity. So these are all protected under the Equality Act. And the reason why I mention the Equality Act here is because it has the way in which you're using judgment to select someone. There's a danger that this Equality Act comes into play. And here is some statistics from a few years back now, which shows how this plays quite obviously in managers' responses in a survey around recruitment, where 10% of managers said they would not recruit a married woman. 20% said they would not recruit a pregnant woman, and 4% of these managers surveyed said they would not recruit someone whose name was not a familiar name that they felt was common to their community. So already, even at the, you can see at this stage that discrimination is starting to have a part in the recruitment and selection process. So part of the presentation today is to always encourage you to always challenge the process you use, the judgments you make all the time, on the basis that you will have bias in the way in which, however objective you try to be, you will make biased judgments. You will make biased judgments. The reason why the Equality Act comes into place so much at the recruitment stage is that there is a potential for discrimination claims, and you should be aware that there is no cap on the maximum award for unlawful discrimination. And the latest data that we have is from 21-22. So these are discrimination cases that have gone to employment tribunal, and you can see the median award for sex discrimination claim is around £18,000 against the employer. And the maximum award in this year was an award of £228,000 for a race discrimination case. So you can see we're talking about big chunks of money here. I'm just giving you some sort of not extreme examples, but I guess the maximum award is an extreme example, but that varies from year to year. It can be more than that. In some years, it depends on the case and the injuries that are awarded to some employee that's taken, or potential candidate that's taken the employer to court. So there's potentially a massive impact if you get this process wrong around discrimination claims. And I don't want to scare you, it's just to encourage you to follow best practice when following a recruitment and selection process. So let's start at the beginning. And the beginning of this process is always the role that you're wanting to fill. And before you do that, you need to have a job description. And that job description needs to define the purpose of that role and make it very clear why that you need that job in your small charity, and what are the key accountabilities, what are the key responsibilities. And in my experience of working in larger organizations and dealing with probably thousands of jobs, you're looking at normally only between 3 and 8 accountabilities, responsibilities for any role, whatever level. And it's really important that you think about how you emphasize the outputs. What do you want that role to do? What do you want the outputs of that role to be? And you build up I've put a mind map here, because if you're starting from a blank sheet of paper, this is a good place to start, is to mind map out the role and what you see as the key accountabilities. And I think I've put just to give you an idea of what this could look like, a rough mind map. This is my role. as an HR consultant. And I've only seen myself with 3 of the lime green are the my key accountabilities. So the key one is HR support and advice. Then I've got administrative activities to support my business. And then I've got continuous professional development. And there may be things that you can see that span out from that, but that is essentially my role. And then once you've got that mind map, then you can start to develop a job description. Now, what's important, and often with some of my clients in the small charity sector, what they don't do is then go on to build a person specification, and they go hand in hand. You have a job description that defines the responsibilities, those accountabilities for the role, and the person specification sits alongside it and will include the information on the skills, knowledge and experience, qualifications or equivalent required, the personal qualities and values that you expect to see in the role holder. And it should directly link back and complement the job description. And the reason I say this, it may be obvious, but often I will see in a job description quite an emphasis on a role being able to manage a team, for example, and manage people. But in the person specification, there is no mention of their ability to manage people and to be able to manage performance of their team. So that's just one example of showing how you need to, what's mentioned in your job description, you should then link across and define what you would expect to see in terms of skills, knowledge and experience for that role holder to be able to undertake that job description. And it's really key here in the person specification, once again, you challenge yourself to think about, are these selection criteria, the person specification, are these objective criteria and are they non-discriminatory? And then another useful exercise is to think about which of these are absolutely essential for the role holder to be able to do this job, and which of these are actually a cherry on the top. You know, they're desirable, but it's not be all and end all if someone didn't have that particular criteria. The purpose of the person specification that I've already sort of alluded to is that it helps you to find the selection criteria that you're going to use in the recruitment process. So that's why it becomes really important to define those and to understand which are essential and which are desirable, because you will be using those to select candidates against. And once you have a candidate in the role, they will be useful as a management tool to help you define any training and development needs that the role holder might have, the new role holder might have in this job. So the reason I'm giving you some examples now, these are real case examples of what I've seen or I've known to be included in a person specification for a role, and whether this is okay to say in terms of thinking about discrimination. So the first one, and just shout out here, do you think it's okay to say in a person spec, English must be your first language?
I'm going to say no.
And why is that?
Because if the requirements of the job are that you're fluent in English, it doesn't mean to say that it needs to be your first language, as long as you can evidence you're fluent in English.
Absolutely. So the way in which it's worded is completely inaccurate. It is not describing the requirements of the role, which is, as you said, is exactly right, that you want them to be able to be of a certain standard in speaking written English, but to actually say English must be your first language is directly race discrimination. It's race discrimination. Second one, what do you think it's okay to say this? Must have GCSE English and Maths at grade C or higher.
I'm going to say yes, but I'd probably put or equivalent on the end, because that feels like an objective measure.
Yeah, it is an objective measure, but it's potentially age discrimination to have it just as it's written, because I don't have GCSE English and Maths at grade C or higher. I'm too old to have GCSE English and Maths. Equally
also,
now,
it would exclude people who are on the baccalaureate.
Yep. you can start to see, if you start to scrape the surface. That's why I say you have to really challenge, because on the surface something might seem really innocuous and say, well, what could possibly be wrong with this? But when you start to challenge yourself, you think, no, it's excluding people. Written in that way, it's excluding people. So you need to think about, or equivalent is as Tracy mentioned, is a great catch-all, because you're not saying it can only be a GCSE. It could be an equivalent qualification in a different country, in a different system, but it shows that you are able to operate at the level required in terms of your English and maths. Do you think it's okay to say would suit candidates in the first 5 years of their career?
No.
Why not?
It's ageist.
It certainly is. It certainly is. You should really, ideally, in terms of best practice, if you look at the Equality and Human Rights Commission guidance code of practice, they would suggest that you do not use years of experience, because what you're trying to define, and that's a lazy way of putting it, is the level of skills, knowledge that they have had achieved in their roles up to that point. Because the common comment made here would be, you could have 5 years of doing exactly the same thing in the first year and then repeating it in the second, third, fourth, fifth year. So you're not developing your skills, you're just doing exactly the same. So it's harder, but the best practice would be that you define that knowledge, skills that you expect to see in this role, rather than sort of be lazy and say, oh, you'd need to have 5 to 10 years experience to be able to do this job. You can't do that. It's age discrimination. What about the last one? Is it okay to say must have a clean driving licence?
Is the issue the word clean, as in, isn't it having a driving licence? Because you might have 3 points off, but you're still a legal driver.
It depends on the role. So this one is all about what. So if this were a driving role, would this be okay to say? So the person is driving 100% of the time.
Yes, I would say if the role was a driving role, as you say, for 90% of the time.
Yeah. What about if this were an admin role and they were expected from time to time to go out into the community to meetings, and so you were saying they must have a clean driving licence to go to these meetings out in the community? Would that be okay to say?
I'd say no, because that would discriminate against people who maybe haven't got a car, they may not be able to afford a car, and if it's occasional meetings, you can get public transport or taxis.
Yeah, and in terms of Equality Act and thinking about protected characteristics, you may have a disability, which means you are unable to drive, but you're able to use public transport or other transport and get around to the meetings in the community. So much better to say something around being able to attend meetings in the community, which would be at these various places, would be a better way of putting it in the person spec, rather than saying must have clean driving licence, which would be potentially discriminatory and get you into trouble.
Yeah, I'm thinking epilepsy there.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
Do you know what's scary, Sonia? I think I've seen all of those.
I know. Well, that's why
time.
In my favourite one, which I haven't put up, which I actually saw in my village where I live, was something along the lines of this would suit a local. It said something like, this is for a handyman and would suit a local person who's retired. You know, they managed to get practically about 3 or 4 protected characteristics that they were sort of crossing off the list, because handyman, that title is not appropriate. Local is an interesting one, because this is a predominantly white area, so it's potentially race discrimination to sort of try and attract someone in just from the local village. The fact that retired, that's age discrimination. You know, it just went on and on and on. It was an age not good. So yes, you will see this. It's not hard to find examples of adverts that are not following best practice and potentially unlawful. So when you're attracting applicants, you need to think about advertising, and I put internal versus external here because you may have an obligation to advertise internally or let your current employees be aware of any jobs being advertised, because they're coming to end of fixed term contracts and you have an obligation to maintain their employment with you wherever possible. In terms of external advertising, this is sort of entering the realm of marketing, really. You're marketing your job and your organisation to the outside world, and in the way in which you put the job advert together needs to be non-discriminatory, as we've just shown in a previous slide, and it should be designed to attract the right applicants. And in doing that, there's an element of self-selection. So, for example, if there's a qualification or experience that's absolutely essential, you need to make that really clear in the advert, and you should be very clear about how people should apply and what the deadline should be for applications, and have that all well outlined in the advert. And where I think it was Anne that you were talking about being confident about where you advertise in the right places. So this is, as I said, this is a bit of a marketing exercise, and I'm not a marketing expert, but one of the skills here is to think about the job market, or where you're going to be fishing for this appropriate candidate for this particular role. Sometimes it might be a very small pond in your local area, and other times it might be a massive lake or ocean, because you'll want to bring it to a greater audience. Depends on the level and the complexity of the role, and where you think you might best find that individual who has those appropriate skill sets. But the best approach always is to do a bit of a scattergun approach. So don't become too focused, and think about how you do that, whether it's online or the old-fashioned way of on notice boards in your local area. But the more avenues or modes of advertising that role, the better your spread and ability to find those people who can meet that spec that you're looking for. At this point, going back to equalities, you can see this is a theme that runs all the way through this, is just to be aware of unconscious bias. There's quite a bit of, I guess, controversy around this, because you can receive training on unconscious bias, but there is some uncertainty about how effective that is. And what I mean by unconscious bias is that it's the prejudices that we all have and act on without even thinking, and that's the reason why they're unconscious, and often without malicious intent. And I like the way in which someone's, this is a lovely definition of it, which is, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So it's our own life experiences that are colouring our judgment. And on that basis, then, I would say that when you're going into a recruitment and selection process, you have to accept that you will have bias, and the way in which you set up your recruitment and selection process is to try and eliminate as much as possible your own individual bias. And the reason why this is important is that you're in danger of recruiting on the basis of your bias rather than fact, rather than non-discriminatory evidence. And you run a real risk of not recruiting the best person for the role. And in fact, your unconscious bias might be discriminatory and unlawful, and often it will be. And a great example of this, I love to tell, is I did some training for some managers of a medium-sized charity a few years back, and they had real problems finding drivers to bring their service users to their centres. Real problem finding good drivers. And it was interesting, I think the majority of the drivers were older, retired men. And after we'd done this, they'd been on a sort of a more comprehensive training than 1 hour, but I sort of really challenged them to unpick their job description, person specification, put it back together in terms of the driver role and what was absolutely essential, because they had a list that went on for 2 pages of all the things that were absolutely essential for this driver to have. But they sort of stripped it all back. And one of the managers went away, unbeknown to me, between our training sessions, and selected someone for interview who just didn't fit the mode, the idea of their perfect driver, because she was young, she could drive, she had tattoos all over her body, but she was very engaging and really good communication skills. And the manager took a punt on her, and much to the horror of some of her people in her team, recruited her to the role of driver, and she made a really, really good driver. So it's essentially stripping out all that bias, all that unnecessary selection criteria, had then removed all those obstacles that would have been in the way of someone, a young woman, who maybe was not their ideal in terms of how she displayed herself, became a very good driver for the charity. In terms of shortlisting, in the way in which to avoid bias, discriminatory practice, is never do the recruitment process on your own. Always do it with at least one other person. So at the shortlisting stage, where you have got candidates have applied for the job, you want to have at least two of you looking at producing the shortlisting criteria, which should flow directly from your person specification and relate to the requirements of the job, and scoring independently, not together, using a point system to be fair and objective. And what I mean by a point system, it can be as simple as 0 does not meet selection criteria, 1 does meet, 3 exceeds. It could be a bit more nuanced than that, but that's essentially to give some sort of weighting to the information that your applicants are providing. So as I said, each recruiter should assess and shortlist applications individually, and only when they've done that, then all those that have been involved in shortlisting should come together and meet to agree the final shortlist and who should be invited to interview. And what's important throughout this process is that you record and keep notes of any decision and rationale for why you've made those decisions. And you should keep that information for at least 6 months. And the reason why you should keep it for at least 6 months is because any of those candidates or applicants applying for this role could, in theory, take you to an employment or make a claim to an employment tribunal for discrimination, whether it's direct or indirect discrimination. So you need to keep your records for at least 6 months to ensure that you've got evidence that you might need if there were a potential claim made against you. This all comes under your general data protection retention process. So moving on through this whistle-stop tour, in terms of a small charity, these would be the selection methods I would foresee that you would use most frequently. I think you would be using an application form for the selection method, where you'd be asking for focused, defined information from applicants. In this format of an application form, it's much better. You're much better able to structure the information you get to help you with shortlisting, which is not the case for the CV. So a CV is not really best practice way in which to proceed with the recruitment and selection process. So an application form is much better, much more objective. You then have the interview as a selection method, and I've defined here unstructured versus structured interview. What I mean by that is a structured interview is where you have defined your questions on the basis of your person specification, which are the selection criteria you've used to shortlist. And so you have specific questions, the same for each candidate, which define or help you acquire the information you need from the applicant to see whether they can meet a particular selection criteria or not. What an unstructured interview is essentially is just a conversation. It's just a conversation that you have. It'll be different. The questions you ask will be different for each individual. It will tend to be just on the basis of the CV or the application form that you've got. And it may deviate quite widely from achieving any information that's useful to see whether they are able to meet your selection criteria or not. So obviously I'm advising you don't have an unstructured interview, it's very structured. Job sample tests are really, really helpful in selection methodology for an applicant, because often you might have a candidate who's really good at interview, very good at answering your questions. But in my experience, when you give them a job sample test, which could be anything from, for example, you want them to be able to use Excel spreadsheets, or you want them to be able to communicate effectively, so you ask them to do a short 5-minute presentation. It's at the job sample test when things might tend to wobble a bit, and you can be quite surprised by what looks like a really good candidate in the interview stage is in fact not good at actually carrying out the job in practice. So I would always highly recommend that you think about a job sample test for most of the roles that you might be interviewing for. And all of this process, once again, just ramming it home again, it needs to be non-discriminatory and reduce unconscious bias. So what that means is you go for an application form rather than a CV. You go for a structured interview rather than an unstructured interview. You go for a job sample test rather than just think we haven't got time for this, because it will give you really good, rich information about whether they can actually do the job in practice. When it comes to interview skills, once again, you can reduce potential discrimination and bias by the way in which you set up the interview panel. So it should be a panel. Shouldn't be one person, it should never be one person. And in terms of the composition, wherever possible, you should try and make it as diverse as you can within your organisation. And you need to develop those set structured questions which are based on the selection criteria that you've developed, and decide who's going to ask what questions and who will take notes, because normally it's really hard to actively listen when you ask a question and take notes at the same time. So as a panel, when one person's asking questions, another person should take the notes. And it's really important here that all of those on the panel are really actively listening and observing a candidate's response to questions, because sometimes what people can say can be really good, but how their body language is portrayed can be quite interesting, let's put it like that, in that it gives you a different message from what they're actually saying in practice. And it's really important here that you make clear objective notes based on the evidence you're given in that interview to support your selection decision further down the line. And once again, those are notes that you need to keep hold of for at least 6 months. And in terms of interviewing skills, it's really important to think about using open questions. So the how, what, where, why questions, rather than the closed questions, whether you're just going to get a yes or a no answer, because that will give you a whole wealth and richness of information by asking nice open questions. And the funnel approach is sort of a one technique which works really well, where you ask a really nice open question, one of your structured questions, and then of course you can probe, you can and there are particular areas that you just need to know a bit more information, you can ask specific questions around that, and you can close off by, in summary, saying is my understanding of this that you have experience in X, Y and Z. Then you would get a yes or no, but it actually then clarifies your understanding of what the information they're giving you. Questions to be avoided, my pet hate is the last one, which is a hypothetical question, where you might say, what would you do in this circumstance? And then you'd set them a hypothetical scenario, because you're going to get a hypothetical response. So much better to ask, what I would always suggest here is to say, for example, in your past role, can you give me an example of where you've had to deal with a difficult or aggressive client and how you handled it? Much better to do it in that way, where you'll get a real case scenario information back, rather than to put it in a hypothetical way. When you make your decision about who you'd like to offer the role to, I'm jumping very quickly forward here, but this is just a key learning point here, is any verbal job offer you make is a contract, is an employment contract. So you must always ensure that when you offer someone the job verbally, you must say this is subject to the right, that you have the right to work in the UK. If you haven't already done those checks, that you have the right, it's subject to satisfactory references, and it's subject to DBS checks and any other pre-employment checks that you might need to do, so that you don't just offer it without these being subject to these various pre-employment checks. That's really important. And I'm going to end here to give you some time to ask questions with what the key points here would be, which is you've got to be really clear at the onset of what the role is that you're recruiting to and what the requirements are, and really challenge yourself over that. So don't just sort of blow the dust off an old job description that's been there for 15 years and say, yeah, that'll do. Really, really look through. And you might even need to start with a blank sheet of paper and doing a mind map, sort of put it aside. Don't be coloured, your judgment not coloured by that, and start again, potentially. Be aware at every stage of potential discrimination and unconscious bias. You've got to really be careful about that. And you need to maximise objectivity and collect evidence. So that's all about maximising objectivity is all about involving more than just yourself in the process, and collecting evidence, keep notes of everything, and keep for at least 6 months. And you need to plan and prepare the selection process to be used. Don't undertake it on your own. So those would be my key sort of learning points. And as a good colleague and friend who spent most of her life in recruitment, one of her key learning points would be, over recruiting thousands of people into a job, into jobs, would be, her key learning point is, if you have any doubt about a candidate and the doubt around offering the job, don't do it. Because just don't do it, because she's seen the sort of the ramifications of making a poor recruitment decision and running with it rather than starting again. In terms of signposting, the places I would go for further information about recruitment would be the ACAS website, gov.uk, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and especially the Employment Statutory Code of Practice, which outlines in chapter and verse over several hundred pages what you should be thinking about in terms of best practice around the Equality Act. NCVO, if you're a member, you have access to more of their website, but they have some really good general information. And obviously Community Action Network, I'll give them a plug as well. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and as I said, that really was a whistle-stop tour, but I'm happy now to answer any questions that you have around that. Tracy.
Thanks, Sonia. That was really useful. I know it was a bit of a whistle stop, but really useful framework there to find out more information. I've just got a question, and this was in relation to volunteer and trustee roles.
Yeah.
What's the view about collecting information about candidates as part of the application form in relation to their age, race, etc.?
Yeah, well, I would point you in the direction of the Information Commissioner's Office website, and they have information on collection of this, what's considered special category data. It's sensitive information, because essentially you're collecting information on protected characteristics, aren't you?
Yeah.
Now, you have the right to do that, but you have to then outline that right, the legal right that you're going to use in a privacy notice, which would be focused, directed to those people or those groups of people where you're going to collect that information, and explain why you're collecting that information and how you're going to use that information. So it's entirely appropriate. And in larger organisations, they would say, we have an equalities action plan around these protected characteristics, and this information feeds directly into that, anonymised, so that we can see how actions that we're taking are having an impact on our diversity moving forward. Now, for some small charities, and I spoke to one quite recently about this, if you're not going to do this at this stage, because there's only 2 of you in the organisation, you're not going to need that information. You won't use it. The only information you like to use would be health information. Could be, because if someone discloses that they have a disability and need reasonable adjustments, then you might need to get further information from them, and you will hold that information. So you will need to make that clear. But in terms of the wider range of protected characteristics. As a small charity, you may not need to collect it. But if you do decide to collect it, because that's really important to you, then you need to have a privacy notice that you give to those, you issue to those applicants, that explains the legal reason why you need to collect that information.
Okay, and that information should be collected anonymously, do you think, Sonia?
Yes, because otherwise, well, you're not going to get information given to you at the same level if it's not anonymous. Normally, and it should be kept separate. The equality information should be kept separate from the application form, so that the people shortlisting have no idea about that information that's been collected separately. It might be difficult to do in a small organisation, but they need to be kept quite separate.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's reinforced the point I made, but got a bit of a pushback on that. So thanks very much.
Okay.
Sonia, hi, it's Anne here. In terms of positive discrimination, so if, for instance, as a growing charity, we thought we want greater diversity within our charity because of the work that we're doing, we need to be more representative, etc. You've talked about obviously avoiding discrimination, but how do you do the opposite? Yeah.
Okay, so positive discrimination is in most cases unlawful, so you cannot positively discriminate. So that's put that to one side. You can't do that. There are some instances, quite unusual, where you can. Let me try and give you some examples. So it would be, for example, if you were a religious organisation and you were recruiting, I can think of churches where someone needs to be a particular religion because they are providing sermons and it's all around, for example, or you're a women's prison and you need women to be carrying out certain personal duties for those women. You wouldn't want a man. So in very, very specific cases, you can have positive discrimination, but as a general rule, no. What you can, though, consider is positive action. So positive action is where you have underrepresented. You can show, you have the data that you have underrepresented people of a particular personal protected characteristic. So, for example, let's say you're a small organisation and all of your employees are white. You might then say, the whole way in which you might pitch your whole recruitment selection process might be around how are we going to get into communities that are not white communities. So there'll be a piece about how you're going to advertise this role. And then you might say in your advert, we would particularly welcome applications from, and you need to think about the word in here, but non-white or ethnic minorities because are currently underrepresented in our workforce. Further information on all of this can be found at the Equality and Human Rights Commission website under the Code of Practice that I talked about. It's just a real tome, but I actually have it bookmarked on my screen because the number of times I go to it and it will give you guidance on how you can go about wording and framing it and examples of where it's allowed. It's a great reference document to have. So positive action is what you can do.
Great. So it's the terminology I was using incorrectly.
Yeah, so it's positive action. It's not positive discrimination. And positive action could even be around, for example, I've seen it working when I've worked in the higher education sector, where at the highest level of academic level of professor, though it was women were very underrepresented. And so what you can do is you can have positive action, which is around specific training courses just for women who are at the step below, which then provide confidence building techniques they can use to promote themselves, blah, 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 blah. And you can do that because you've got the data in that organisation to show that they're underrepresented at the next level. You're not saying, oh, you will get promoted to be a professor, but you're actually equipping them with the skills to be able to then put themselves forward on a level playing field with male candidates as well.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
May I ask another one if there's no others?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
really
fire
cheeky.
away. No.
I was going to say, what we tend to do in our charity is we follow a lot of what you were talking about, and we hold interviews on a given date. We advertise that date within the adverts, etc. I have seen other smaller charities saying that they'll do interviews on a rolling basis. Are there pros and cons of doing that? I mean, obviously they may get someone quicker, but my concern would be, are they then able to properly evaluate people? You're shaking your head.
I don't know why I would do it on a rolling basis. That my experience, well, I haven't done recruitment for years, you know, in terms of practically getting my hands sort of messy doing recruitment. But the problem always is losing good people who've applied. So that would my preference would be to try and keep all the timescales as tight as possible, like it's sort of it's sort of a well-oiled machine, so that there's no delay. And if you go for a roll-in, right, so this is anecdotal, this is not sort of objective, or, you know, this is just like going like this. My view is sometimes the good applicants come in near the end of the process of the deadline, because they've taken their time to research you as an organisation, think about how they're going to put forward their application. They're not whacking it off and putting it in within a few days. So if you had it on a rolling basis, you might be recruiting someone because you're sort of terrified of not finding anyone. This issue of, as I said, with my good HR colleague who said you recruit someone that you've got some doubts about, but you're thinking, oh, but they'll do. Put them in the role and then you repent at leisure, because there'll be performance issues. The sure will be performance issues. So my view would be not to do it on a rolling basis, unless someone can argue that's on this webinar today that there are advantages. I can't see what the advantages would be.
No, Sonia, I agree with you there. And I was reading something recently that I really agreed with, which is that it's also potentially discriminatory by accident, because some people who may need support in their application, for an example, a dyslexic person who thinks, oh, I'll get my friend or my brother to help me at the weekend.
Yeah.
You know, that's thrown out.
Absolutely. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So I just don't, I think there's lots of reasons why I don't like a rolling basis. I can't see why you would do that, other than you're just desperate to find someone and you think that would be a good way of catching someone quickly. And also you might have, the problem with not having a defined timescale is that you might have, let's say, a difficult applicant who might say, oh, I've just, what am I trying to say? If you've got a defined timescale, then someone who might be difficult and saying, oh, can I just squeeze in? I know you said midday today, but it's only tomorrow. It can play to your advantage to say, no, deadline was midday. That's it. Sorry. That, once again, that's anecdotal, just from my experience. You can have some very awkward characters out there in terms of trying to apply for your job and not following the process that you've outlined, and trying to wheedle their way in.
I think we're getting quite close to the end of the session now. Time is ticking along. Are there any kind of last questions for Sonia? I'm going to quickly pop in chat a link to our questionnaire about today's webinar. It's really important and nice for us if we can get feedback from that. So please click on that and just spend a few minutes giving us your feedback on today. Are there any more questions? I've definitely been caught out by rolling application cycles before. It's a horrible experience. Not a fan.
What, being an applicant?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't. Yeah.
So spending the whole weekend preparing something, sending it in, and they've closed early.
I think it's okay if you're in a large organisation and you have maybe a high turnover, so there are always roles available. and then you could just have almost an open-ended recruitment process. But I don't think any of you would be in that position at all.
I think that can work for like call centre work.
Yeah. So I am thinking this. The reason I was shaking my head is you're just so small. There's just no reason to have it on a rolling basis.
Before we go, Sonia, is there anything you need to plug or promote? Anything coming up that I might?
No, well, I would just I guess something else to think about. This is just there's so much you can emphasize when you're interviewing. You should never ask any health related questions in interview, and if an applicant does disclose a disability in the interview, then the response back would be, would this affect your ability to do any part of this role? Would it require any reasonable adjustments? But you need to be very careful, and it's only after you've offered the individual the job that you might then want to look at looking at what the reasonable adjustments might be. So it's based purely on merit rather than any protected characteristic, the decision to recruit or not. And the same would go with, for example, if you had someone who was pregnant, you're not making that decision on that basis of their pregnancy, it's on their ability to do the job. And then you look at the practicalities of how that's going to work in practice when you offer them the role, and take that forward.
The sickness one's quite challenging though for a very small charity.
Yeah.
we discovered, and I hope the rest of you don't laugh, that we didn't realise that we paid the statutory sick pay. And so if you are literally struggling with incomes, that's really challenging if then your worker isn't working.
Yeah, but that's making an assumption that that a candidate with a disability would have a high level of sick.
Oh yeah, no, I didn't mean disability.
No,
I just meant if somebody didn't disclose a condition. Is a condition ever not a disability?
It may not. It depends. It does. Yeah. You wouldn't know until you've done some. You normally need to take some medical advice unless they disclose that it was a disability. But even then, you'd have to have a conversation with the individual, because some conditions wouldn't be a disability. I mean, that's often that's why it's very difficult, because you might take someone on who doesn't have a disability but doesn't have a good attendance, and then you're moving on to, that's why you have a probationary period in which you need to manage performance and monitor and review, because then you have that window in which you can decide not to confirm an appointment if they can't provide you with what's required in that particular role, and one of those might be a particular level of attendance.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I've just had a lot of cases recently of people performing really disappointingly in probation. So for me, that would indicate poor recruitment decisions, that it could be that they haven't defined the role appropriately. So they have got someone who matches their requirements, but their requirements were wrong. So their foundations are wobbly because they hadn't really thought clearly about what they actually really needed in the job. So I've seen a lot, I don't know why, in the last few months, a lot of people failing their probationary period. And then small charities needing support with how to deal with that.
No more questions. I end it on a positive note. I love that quote. We don't see things as we are, we see things as we are. I'd never heard that before, and I love that.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.